I'm about 38 years old. I was born in a Hindu Brahmin family, born in England, raised up between England and India. I embraced Islam about 23 years ago. I was 15 at the time, 15, 16. My uncle had died in very tragic circumstances around about the age of 15. And in the Hindu tradition, the eldest son has to perform the final funeral rites. And so he only had 3 daughters. I was the son of his elder brother, and I counted as his sort of eldest son. It was very close to him. So I ended up going to Banaras, which is a place in India, sometimes pronounced as Vanaras, which is a place where they perform the final rites, and where usually the body is taken, burnt, and turned into ashes, and flowed into the Ganges. So I went there, and I had to do a series of rites for my uncle. And at the final point, I even saw the ashes of his body, and I saw this along the ghat, along the area where a lot of bodies are being burnt regularly, and they turned into ashes and they literally flowed into the water. It kind of struck me that life is, at least the way we think of it, is very impermanent. And the whole idea of death as being so close was something that really, really struck me. And so from the age of about 15, I started looking into what death means in other traditions and the afterlife. And being a Hindu, I looked into my own tradition first, and the whole idea of rebirth and karma and so on was something that I was looking into. And then I started looking into other religions, Judaism, Christianity. And one of the things that I always held on to was that there's lots of different paths. All these religions are fine as long as anyone takes a religion, and they're all reaching to God at the end. Until I came across Islam, and Islam was probably the last possible religion I would have been looking at, partly because in those days, now it's probably 10 times worse, but in those days they had a bit of bad publicity, and I remember reading a couple of Reader's Digest articles, which was the book that often used to have a few things about real life events, and they'd have these real life stories, and they'd often have a bad story of somebody being forced to wear the hijab, or anyway, cut a long story short. When I started looking at Islam, what struck me was it didn't appear what it should have appeared to be. So it wasn't, an Arabian religion 14 centuries ago, one of many other religions. So there's Hinduism, that wonderful combination of different faiths, and from the Indian subcontinent, different ways of thinking, because the term Hindu itself is kind of a catch term for lots of different ways of looking at things within the Indian subcontinent. And then you had Judaism, which is kind of the people of Judea, the people of Israel, the tribe, and so on. And Christianity generally centering on the person of Christ and what happened, and the idea of his redemptive sacrifice. But Islam was kind of giving a more broader message. For starters, the Prophet Muhammad, who's, at least to my mind, seemed the founder of Islam, is not mentioned in the Quran apart from 3 times. And the Quran's got a whole chapter on Mary. Well, she's not Arab, technically, in my mind. And then there's Abraham popping up, and Noah popping up, and Jesus popping up. And what's that got to do with, Arabia at that time? And then a different narrative started emerging. So the first narrative I had was there's lots of different paths, everyone's going to God. And then a different narrative emerged, which is God is one, and the essence of his path of submitting to that oneness is one. And he has been sending different messengers to each and every nation from the beginning of time until now. And that was, Adam was the first. And that religion, for all intents and purposes, in Arabic could be called Islam, or that way could be called Islam, but that is the one path, that is the path of God. And it's broad enough to accommodate these various things. And when I struck that, it was kind of, whoa. Now this is a challenge, because I could sit back in my comfort zone and say there's lots of different ways, and we're all one big happy family, and all you need is love, and all of that stuff. And Bob Marley's One Love, One Life, and all that stuff. But then I've got this message saying, this is it. This is the truth. And this is just the final embodiment. But that truth has been coming from the beginning of time, and it will keep coming, because that truth is the message of the cosmos. That truth is the message that's being shown to you over and over and again. And so then it was a bit of a thing. That doesn't fit the Islam that I'm reading in Reader's Digest, or today they could just say the Islam that you see on television, or the Islam that is constantly being bombarded. It's a deeper Islam. It's the Islam of the soul. It's the Islam that at some point it's like, I think I know this. And so that process, initially it was a kind of a, how do I debate with this? And I had a couple of friends at school who started to get more into their practice of Islam. And so I used to often debate with them women's rights and, violence in Islam and all my little things. And I was quite good with words, so I found that I would win the arguments, but when I left them and I went home, I would lose the debate. Because at some point I knew that I was winning with points, but there's a deeper level of conviction that had started to rise in my heart about what's being said. And so the whole process just kept going, and I feel, looking back now, God sort of created a conflation of events that were happening at that time. And I was being exposed to Islam and different, people close to me. So my school teacher, she actually embraced Islam. And it was just, my life changed after that. But, later on I heard that, there's that whomsoever Allah wills to guide, he gives them expansion. He expands his chest lil Islam, he expands his chest for God. And sometimes there's a term, I think it's called yuqallib, to literally turn a person. And that was my sensation. I literally felt I was turned and I was span, and it was like this sense of expansion. So, yeah. And then what was really interesting is the next day when I told people I wanted to become Muslim, and I said what I did, the way you become Muslim, it was just a coming home. It's like, oh, this is me. This is a part of me. This is what I've always known somehow, somewhere I should be doing. Well, during that 7-month period, I think the first part of it was sort of just opening up to, because it wasn't conscious. I don't think, looking back, I could say that I was, deliberately thinking about something. It was just subconsciously, or at that time, I was realizing that I'm starting to believe. And then I think the biggest reason why there was a delay, which in hindsight I think was partly because I just didn't think it was possible. I didn't think someone born in a Hindu Brahmin family could actually become Muslim. It didn't seem possible to me. It was not something I could have entertained, because I didn't actually, I don't think I knew of any converts from Hinduism. So I couldn't imagine someone from Hinduism could become Muslim, and at least not in the background that I had. So it was a very relaxed, not very strong, Hindu type, but as is common to many, at least that kind of Hindu upper class Brahmin sort of environment, it's sort of like a very relaxed identity, shrouded on, like festivals and, just tight-knit family, very close, well off, not many problems. And then, why would you do that? Why would I convert? It was not something, it never came to me. And then even as the faith was emerging, it was sort of like, yeah, but it's kind of like growing as a seed. It sprouted. And when it was, I believe this. Now what does that entail? And when that thing happened, then it was always like, this is a bridge. And can I ever cross it? Can I ever actually take that step? I mean, what would my family say? What would anyone say? And then I think what finally pushed it over was that, God actually created an environment around me where I saw other people convert. And someone who I really looked up to, who had converted a year or two before, and his life had literally changed. I was walking with him, and he literally looked at me and he said, you don't know how long you're going to live. You don't know how much time you've got. And he said, don't you want to live your life, or at least profess, say what it is that you believe in to to yourself. There were a lot of challenges that came afterwards that, had I sat and thought about it, probably would have prolonged it a lot more than 7 months. But the fact that I took that step, from that point onwards, I found there is no way that God's support does not come. God's support in the most amazing ways. I think for a lot of converts, the real proof becomes their post-conversion stories, especially when there's so much family pressure against them. You think there's no way, just when you think it's all, I've got no way out, there's some, support coming, the most amazing ways. Post-conversion in the beginning, I mean, my family obviously had a hard time with it. I was 16, they could not understand why I would do something like that, and it took them a while to actually think there was a genuineness involved and there wasn't a lady somewhere or some kind of drug fueled project behind my reason for becoming Muslim. But to cut a long story short, there were a lot of trials, there were tribulations, but I ended up going from England to India where my parents were residing. I was there for a couple of years, but I found within that a sweetness and God always providing support just when it got difficult. And then through time, and I think this is something, if I had the chance to give advice to myself looking back and also to someone in that situation, was to take things easy, to try and embody things through their character and the core of Islam, and not feel that they always need to get their point across. Because I did feel very strongly that I really wanted to convey what it was that I knew, without realizing that sometimes your actions and your state speaks louder than your words. And so there was that kind of initial tussle, but I think as my family got to know me better, and my immediate family, and time itself has a healing, is that now, I mean, it's my immediate family really, there's a real closeness. When I go there, when I visit my parents, it's like, everything is a norm. It's a norm for me to pray there. It's my identities. My mother, refers to me sometimes by a Muslim name. I go on Friday prayers, and but there is an element of respect, and my dad is always really keen on, Islamic speakers, and so there is an element of that, and I think a lot of that is kind of just through trying to just also a reassurance of just a very human level. You are their son. You are the person that they've known, and to the degree that at your core you're still who you were. And you're just trying to be more genuine in that, and what Islam's calling us to. So that's there, yeah. But there are challenges, there are social challenges, and I think the biggest thing is that each of us will probably be challenged in some way to live up. That's part of life, but there is always support of God in those challenges. So. Islam, I wouldn't say changed me, but is continually calling me to change, and is changing me, because Islam is truth. And I think looking back at the age of 16 when I did decide to become Muslim, was that first thing was, it was just liberating to know that there is a truth out there, that there is a point to life. It was so liberating, and I think most of the converts I've spoken to always say that those first few months are just exhilarating, because it's sort of like, oh, how come no one else knows about this? This is like a treasure. Right, but then, as time goes on, it's like the challenge to live up to our lives and that greatest truth. And this is part of faith, right? Being called to what is your greatest truth, what do you really ascribe to? But just having that guidance, just knowing that there is guidance, just knowing that there is a point, knowing was really, really, really peaceful. And I remember it was so overpowering, and it was so comforting that somewhat in my naivety as a 16-year-old, it was like, well, it should be easy. I just tell everyone, and they'll see it exactly the way I do, especially the family. And it wasn't the case, because a lot of these things are not in our own hands. I asked you to ask yourself, what's the deepest form of acceptance? The deepest form of acceptance is the acceptance of the truth you know from your core. And that's what embracing Islam is. It's about being true to the core of what's asking for us to be accepted. Once you accept that, you'll find God comes in your life and makes things easier, and everything you thought that was impossible or otherwise something to be worried about will become possible, and you'll find a way out. That's my hope. Thanks.